welcome John, and we're looking forward to his talk today, which is called Who's Who? Charles Lamb in conversation with William Wordsworth. So over to you, John, and welcome.
Thank you very much, John. Can everybody hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Good, good, good. Right, I've divided this talk into 4 sections and given each one, I hope, a suitably alien title. So I begin with The Two Races of Men. The relationship between Charles Lamb and William Wordsworth was anything but straightforward. Yet throughout their lives, the two men maintained a friendship that proved to be as sympathetic and enduring as it was fragile and edgy. It was a relationship that exposed cultural tensions subsequently incorporated within the term romantic as a description of the period in which they lived. Lamb, as he was always ready to remind people, rejoiced in the fact that he was born and bred in London. Streets, 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 markets, theatres, churches, Covent Gardens. While Wordsworth's aversion to the dehumanizing influence of the city, a prison where he hath been long immured, became a central motif for the way he chose to define himself and his poetry. To her fair works did nature link the human soul that through me ran. For Wordsworth, however, London was also a welcome destination where he could bask in the admiration of enthusiastic readers, while Lamb, in his essay Poor Relations, has Elia complain of having to live in the sneering, prying metropolis. In a letter of 1816 to Thomas Manning, he confessed that returning to London after a time spent among the shepherds and herdesses and dairies and cream pots of Wiltshire was to be compared to being snatched away from heaven and cast back into hell. I know my hour is come. Faustus must give up his soul. O Lucifer, O Mephistopheles. Thou wert a scorner of the fields, my friend, wrote Wordsworth at the time of Lamb's death, but more in show than truth. Summarizing the beliefs of the theologian Friedrich von Hugel, George Tyrrell wrote, all life consists in a patient struggle with irreconcilables. It is a progressive unifying of parts that will never fit perfectly. Tyrrell could equally have been describing the circumstances under which Lamb and Wordsworth managed to maintain their improbable friendship. The inconsistency of both Lamb's and Wordsworth's views on the relative merits of the country and the city direct us towards an aspect of their writing which the two men shared. Both were inclined to assume a variety of personae to deliver their narrative voice, and having done so, to call into question the trustworthiness of that narrator. At the end of his essay, The South Sea House, Lamb Elia writes, reader, what if I have been playing with thee all this while? Implying that not only the names of the people he's been writing about, but their very existence might all have been a fiction. And in New Year's Eve, he goes on to explain that no one, quote, can have a less respect for his present identity than I have for the man Elia. Elia's I remains enigmatic, a shape-shifting author who in Christ's Hospital 35 years ago slides between the identities of several narrators. In The Producers of Modern Art, we're told that the great masters achieved their effect by a wise falsification. In other words, he says, by not showing the actual appearances of what they were depicting. First slide, please. In Amicus Redivivus, the actual appearance of the state of George Dyer's mind, disturbing for a man who spends his time watching hourly for the signs of his sister's insanity, is concealed for much of the essay beneath a comic form of theatrically ornate prose, but not before Elia has confessed in plain English that a spectacle like this at dusk would have been appalling enough, but in the broad open daylight, to witness such an unreserved motion towards self-destruction in a valued friend took from me all power of speculation. Now, had this essay remained in the gift of this narrator, it might well have ended there. But the story is now taken up by a second voice that progressively assumes an exaggerated parodic form of biblical Shakespearean language, culminating in the appearance of a drunken Dionysian quack doctor, summoned to restore his friend to life. This is emphatically a different narrator from the one who wrote the opening paragraphs. He listeneth to detect the wrecks of drowned mortality, partly because the liquids he useth to prescribe to himself are ordinarily more conveniently to be found at these common hostelries, where he findeth, as in the case of my friend, a squeamish subject, he condescendeth to be the taster, and showeth by his own example the innocuous nature of the prescription. The next slide. In his preface to the last essays of Elia by a friend of the late Elia, Lamb reflects on his habit of making himself many, or reducing many unto himself, confessing that what he, Elia, tells us as of himself was often true only historically of another. How the reader should respond to the variety of voices that narrate Wordsworth's poems has long been the subject of critical conjecture. Nowhere more does Wordsworth reveal the insecurity that accompanied.
I'm sorry, hang on, John, you're on mute.
I'm back again. I should be back again. Now, where do you want me to go from?
How the reader should respond to the variety.
How should the reader? Okay. We've looked at Lamb making himself many. So then, how should the reader respond to the variety of voices that narrate Wordsworth's poems has long been the subject of critical conjecture. Nowhere more does Wordsworth reveal the insecurity that accompanied his sense of vocation to be a poet than in Peter Bell, where from the outset his chosen narrator confesses himself inadequate for the task that he's undertaken. Oh, would that some more skillful voice, more further labour might prevent. Kind listeners that around me sit, I feel that I am all unfit for such high argument. While Wordsworth was entertaining the Alfoxden coterie with this light-hearted confession of his sense of authorial inadequacy, he was also impersonating the young, insensitive poet prone to rash judgment in Poets on the Namings of Places, the similarly obtuse narrator of Simon Lee, the self-opinionated adult narrators of Anecdote for Fathers and We Are Seven, and the prurient narrator of The Thorn. Each poem exposed Wordsworth's awareness of his fractured identity, an awareness openly confessed in 1798 in the autobiographical narrative of Tinton Abbey. The identity crisis that both Wordsworth and Lamb experienced were driven to explore in their work was arguably one of the few things that they had in common. And I suggest it might well have contributed subconsciously to the relationship that developed between them. Their backgrounds, however, could scarcely have been more different. Charles Lamb's forebears seem for the most part to have been agricultural labourers or in service. His father worked for over 50 years as a general assistant to Samuel Salt, a barrister at the Inner Temple. Salt sponsored Lamb for a place at Christ's Hospital, and when he left in 1789, he took up a post in the counting house of Joseph Place, although he also harboured pretensions to authorship. In 1792, he became a clerk in accountant's office at East India House. 4 years later, he returned home from work to find that his sister Mary had stabbed their mother to death and wounded their father. Lamb, who had himself recently spent a brief period of time in the Hoxton madhouse, was determined to take responsibility for the care of his sister, a decision that demanded the economic security provided by his post at the East India Company. It was at this time that he first came to know of Wordsworth through Coleridge, his friend from their time together at Christ Hospital. Lamb will soon have realised that Wordsworth's devotion to his sister Dorothy and to his ambition to write poetry existed in a world fundamentally different from his own. But until he made his way down to Somerset in 1797, he can scarcely have imagined what it was like to belong to a literary coterie that had Wordsworth and Coleridge at its centre, or for that matter, to be exposed to the scenic wildness of the Quantock Hills, let alone be expected to climb them. Wordsworth was the son of Sir James Lowther's law agent and spent his early childhood in the comfort and security of the family's Cockermouth home. This fostered a lasting sense of entitlement, which arguably became all the more insistent when Lowther's response to his father's death precipitated their impoverishment and the disintegration of the family unit. Poor as his immediate family had become, Wordsworth enjoyed a degree of liberty that Lamb was never to know. Supported by his uncles, Christopher Cookson and Richard Wordsworth, he went from Hawkshead Grammar School to Cambridge. Lowther's treatment of his family fueled his political radicalism, and he refused to follow the career path mapped out for him by his uncles, travelling instead to France, where he could expect to find allies in his campaign against the tyranny of titles, stars, ribbons, and garters, and other badges of fictitious superiority. That's the letter to Khandaq, of course. By comparison, the shifting moods and voices of Elijah Lamb in the essays and letters suggest that if he was politically radical, it was chiefly by association rather than conviction. When the anti-Jacobin mockingly referred to him as an anarchist, Charles Lloyd wrote indignantly that Lamb was a man too much occupied with real and painful duties, duties of high personal self-denial, to trouble himself about speculative matters. In the preface to the last essays by a friend of Elijah, the verdict given there on Elijah's religious beliefs might equally be applied to his political convictions. Lamb wrote, "With the severe religionist, he would pass for a free thinker, while the other faction set him down for a bigot. All persuaded themselves that he belied his sentiments. Few understood him, and I am not certain that at all times he quite understood himself." So the next slide, please. In The Praise of Chimney Sweepers and The Decay of Beggars in the Metropolis, Lamb Elias succeeds in offering every principle dear to the hearts of contemporary opponents of slavery, offending every principle dear to the hearts of contemporary opponents of slavery in all its forms. So he writes, the sweeping boys are tender novices, blooming through their first nigritude, such as come forth with the dawn or somewhat earlier, with their little professional notes sounding like the peep peep of a young sparrow. I reverence these young Africans of our own growth, who from their little pulpits, the tops of chimneys, in the nipping air of a December morning, preach a letter of patience to mankind. What Lamb was effectively dramatizing the sweeping boys to make them sentimentally acceptable. They had become part of the kind of theatrical performance he describes in Some Old Actors, where what would otherwise be revolting in real life is rendered warm-hearted. In The Decay of Beggars in the Metropolis, Elia Lamb adheres closely to the argument made by Wordsworth in The Old Cumberland Beggar and Scott in The Antiquary, defending public begging on the grounds that the demand to give brings out the best in the rest of us. Or, as Elia puts it, much good might be sucked from these beggars. His description of the London beggar is, to say the least, problematic. There was a dignity springing from the very depth of their desolation. As to be naked is to be so much nearer to the being man than to going in livery. Right, my second section, a quote from Macquarie End. I am terribly shy in making myself known to strangers. If, as was possible, Lamb and Wordsworth met in London in 1795, there was no reason why Wordsworth should have taken particular note of him. He was set on broadening his acquaintances among his already established friends. The first meeting between Lamb and Wordsworth, now living in Dorset, was due between Lamb and Wordsworth that we can be sure of took place in 1796. Coleridge had been in London, and Wordsworth, who was now living in Dorset, was due there for a visit after he left. He therefore gave Lamb the job of returning his manuscript copy of Wordsworth's new poem, Salisbury Plain, to the author. Coleridge no doubt shared his enthusiasm for Wordsworth's poetry with his old school friend, but Lamb's function at this point was essentially that of a go-between. The correspondence of future years bears out the fact that whatever else Lamb became to Wordsworth, his function as a convenient contact for acquiring books or handing books back or on to others was taken for granted. I think Lamb surely had Wordsworth in mind when, in The Two Races of Men, he wrote, "What a careless, even deportment hath your borrower! What rosy gills! What a beautiful reliance on Providence doth he manifest, taking no more thought than lilies! What contempt for money, accounting it, yours and mine especially, no better than dross." I have not forgot your commissions, Lamb reassured Wordsworth in 1800, but the truth is, I am not plethorically abounding in cash at present. In 1796, Wordsworth had done no more than meet one of Coleridge's friends. And from Coleridge, he will no doubt have learnt that the diminutive man with a stutter who returned his manuscript was an old school friend, a clerk at the East India House who had poems currently going to press, along with himself and Charles Lloyd. None of them could have foreseen the circumstances of their next meeting. It was within a short time of this encounter that Mary Lamb stabbed her mother to death, and Coleridge at once urged Lamb to travel down to Somerset in order to help him recover. It's clear that, nervous as he was at the prospect of travelling to Nether Stowey, he was keen to take up the offer for companionship's sake. He wrote to Coleridge, "I see nobody. I sit and read or walk alone and hear nothing," adding miserably, "If I come to Stowey, what conversation can I furnish for those stores of knowledge and of fancy, those delightful treasures of wisdom which I know he," meaning Coleridge, "will open to me." Though exposure to the heady creative atmosphere of Stowey clearly left the young bereaved Londoner reeling under the impact, he was by no means convinced of its benefits, as he was to confess to Coleridge shortly afterwards. He wrote, "I reason myself into the belief that those few and pleasant holidays shall not have been spent in vain." Coleridge, he knew, passionately believed that the key to his friend's recovery lay in his exposure to nature. This proved to be the case, but not at all in the way Coleridge had imagined. Lamb's return to London from what will have been a profoundly alien way of life among utterly unfamiliar surroundings triggered his re-engagement with the cultural life of the metropolis. Once back in London, he had no need to reason himself into any belief about what was needed as a means of coping with his situation, and he set about creating the shape-shifting identity that would make the life of a grafting East India Company clerk bearable. Writing, the theatre, alcohol, tobacco, snuff, companionship, and crowds became indispensable props for his survival. His description of the pleasures of the theatre in Elia's essay on some of the old actors describes what he sought at the time: a delicious confusedness of the head and a veering, undirected goodness of purpose. This was anything but the hungering after nature that Coleridge, in this lime tree bower my prison, claimed he knew Lamb had been craving. Lamb had left his greatcoat behind him in Somerset, and regardless of how he expressed his request for its return, the image of that coat as a metaphor for the danger its owner is in of losing his true self to the suffocating web of Coleridge's and Wordsworth's tightly knit circle becomes clear. Could we have the next slide, please? He was tactfully insistent that he must have the coat back. Is it not ridiculous that I sometimes envy that greatcoat lingering so cunningly behind? Later, writing more candidly as Elia in The Old and the New Schoolmaster, there is more than a hint of the harmful nature of the stifling relationship he had witnessed between Coleridge and Wordsworth while in Nether Stowey. And this is the quotation: "I would not be domesticated all my days with a person of very superior capacity to my own. Too frequent doses of original thinking from others restrain what lesser portion of that faculty you may possess of your own. You get entangled in another man's mind. Your way of thinking, the mold in which your thoughts are cast, must be your own." Lamb's way of thinking and the mold in which his thoughts were cast were very different from those manufactured for him by Coleridge, as his reaction to the Charles Lamb described in This Lime Tree Bower makes clear. Please blot out gentle-hearted and substitute drunken dog, ragged-head, self-shaved, odd-eyed, stuttering, and any other epithet which truly and properly belongs to the gentleman in question. Lamb was beginning to define himself as the product of city life and culture, a complex urban persona that embodied a critique of Wordsworth's perception of modernity rooted in the fair works of nature. Both men were grappling with the need to establish an identity in the wake of their earlier traumatic experiences. And in the process, Lamb was developing an increasingly clear understanding of how he differed from Wordsworth. "The borrowers," he writes in The Two Races of Men, "I choose to designate as the great race, discernible in their figure, port, and a certain instinctive sovereignty." So much for the Wordsworths of this world. Now we come to the Lambs, the lenders. They are born degraded. "He shall serve his brethren." There is something in the air of one of this caste, lean and suspicious, to which Elia might well have added drunken dog, ragged head, soul-shaved, odd-eyed and stuttering. 4 years after his visit to Somerset, Wordsworth invited Lamb to stay with him at Grasmere. And Lamb's response signals the coming of age of the friendship that this unlikely couple were to maintain until Lamb's death in 1834. "With you and your sister, I could gang anywhere," Lamb begins, but then adds, with a characteristic shift of tone, "I am afraid whether I shall ever be able to afford so desperate a journey." The word desperate marks an ironic turn, prompted perhaps by a lingering memory of the time he not only first saw the Quantocks, but discovered that he was expected to walk over them. "Separate from the pleasure of your company, I don't much care if I never see a mountain in my life. I have passed all my days in London until I have formed as many and intense local attachments as any of you mountaineers can have done with dead nature. So now we move on to the third section, distant correspondence. When in receipt of Wordsworth's poetry, Lamb never hesitated to assume the role of an independent, objective literary critic. In the case of lyrical ballads, the nature of his response was of a piece with the forthright manner in which he refused Wordsworth's offer of hospitality at Grasmere. He was far from comfortable with the way Wordsworth was beginning to be idolised, as a letter he wrote to Thomas Manning in 1800 indicates. I have received a very kind invitation from Lloyd and Sophia to go and spend a month with them at the lakes. I need not describe to you the expectations which such an one as myself, pent up all my life in a dirty city, have formed of a tour of the lakes. Consider Grasmere, Ambleside, Wordsworth, Coleridge. I hope you will. Hills, woods, lakes, and mountains, to the devil. I will eat snipes with thee, Thomas Manning. In his letter of 1801 to Wordsworth, this possesses the same characteristic quality of a voice that shifted between genuine appreciation, your very kind invitation to Cumberland, a theatrically assumed performative voice, with you and your sister I could gang anywhere, and passages which by implication mock what he knows is Wordsworth's disapproval of city life and the assumed degradation of those who, like him, eagerly embrace its pleasures of drink, tobacco, and the theatre, not to mention the women. He knew Wordsworth well enough by this time to know how to induce a sharp intake of breath and a patronisingly sad shake of the bardic head. The innumerable trades, tradesmen and customers, coaches, waggons, playhouses, all the bustle and wickedness round about Covent Garden, the very women of the town, the watchmen, drunken scenes, rattles, life awake, if you awake, at all hours of the night, the impossibility of being dull in Fleet Street. Could we have the next slide, please? But there was another Charles Lamb, who read and admired much of Wordsworth's poetry. When, therefore, as Elia, he came to reflect on the welcome escapism he experienced in the reading of plays from an earlier age, it was Wordsworth's invocation of that blessed mood described in Tintern Abbey that came into his mind. Lamb appealed to that happy breathing place from the burthen of perpetual moral questioning that now and then, for a dreamlike while or so, enabled him to imagine a world with no meddling restrictions. And Wordsworth famously described that blessed mood in which the burthen of the mystery, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened. While Lamb was happy to praise those lyrical ballads he enjoyed, albeit with a cavalier carelessness when giving them their titles, he showed himself very ready to express his dislike for those he found less than satisfactory. And from a subsequent letter to Manning, we hear of the reception that Lamb's literary criticism got from Dove Cottage, and not only from Dove Cottage. All the north of England are in turmoil, he wrote. Cumberland and Westmoreland have already declared a state of war. Wordsworth, Lamb's erstwhile reluctant letter writer, has produced 4 sweating pages, which, given the unspoken notion that Lamb as a Londoner begins at a disadvantage, declared that he is, and Lamb is here claiming to quote from Wordsworth's letter, compelled to wish that my rage of sensibility was more extended, being obliged to believe that I should receive large influxes of happiness and happy thoughts, I suppose from the LB, with a deal of stuff about a certain union of tenderness and imagination. Coleridge has also written to him, he tells Manning, 4 long pages, equally sweating and more tedious, assuring me that when the works of true genius, such as W undoubtedly was, do not please me at first sight, I should suspect the fault to lie in me and not in them, etc., 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 etc. What am I to do with such people? Lamb's temerity in taking Wordsworth to task on the shortcomings of his poetry would in normal circumstances have abrupt... would in normal circumstances... Oh, next slide, please. Yes, I've been reminded. Next slide. That's good. Thank you. Lamb's temerity in taking Wordsworth to task on the shortcomings of his poetry would in normal circumstances have abruptly terminated their relationship, but it was not to be so. The reason for this may well have been partly that Lamb continued to be valued as a friend of Coleridge, who deserved support and encouragement on account of his domestic circumstances. But equally, it may have been because Wordsworth genuinely considered Lamb's attempts at literary criticism to be the work of an inferior intellect, and therefore beneath contempt. Writing to Coleridge after Lamb had criticised a manuscript draft of the White Doe of Royston, he pronounced, and here we have it, "Let Lamb learn to be ashamed of himself in not taking some pleasure in the contemplation of this picture, which, supposing it to be even but a sketch, is yet sufficiently made out for any man of true power to finish it for himself. Of one thing be assured, that Lamb has not a reasoning mind, and least of all has he an imaginative one." Another reason for Wordsworth's toleration of Lamb doubtless arose from the fact that in January 1805, the devastating news came through that Wordsworth's brother John had been drowned when his ship went down off Portland Bill. All thoughts of literary issues were laid aside, and Lamb, who was not well himself at this time, worked tirelessly to help the Wordsworths in whatever way he could. It is safe to assume that this event, which must have renewed Charles and Mary's sense of their own loss, cemented the bond of friendship between the families. In 1814, Wordsworth, despite his conviction that Lamb had neither reasoning nor an imaginative mind, was persuaded by Robert Southey to engage him to review The Excursion for the Quarterly Review. This set in train a revealing exchange of letters between the two men, and I've already written about this, we know. We find Lamb searching among his various personae for a means of performing this act of friendship. His letters veer between gossipy companionship and a subtly provocative, ironic questioning of Wordsworth's text. Commenting on Lamb's claim to Wordsworth that reading The Excursion with Mary had given him a day in heaven, Richard Gravel suggests that one has only to imagine Catherine Earnshaw making that remark to realise that it is susceptible of irony. One would not put it quite past Lamb to be implying that Wordsworth's attempt at something of a dramatic form has all the cut and thrust of exchanges between God and Christ, or Adam and the Archangel in Paradise Lost. His exchanges bear quite as little relation to any conversation, to any conversation ever heard on earth. Lamb was clearly keen to reassure Wordsworth, having goaded him many times before with his love of city life, that he would, after a struggle, be able to engage with the places and the people described in the poem. "There is a great deal of noble matter about mountain scenery," he wrote, "yet not so much as to overpower and discountenance a poor Londoner or South Countryman entirely." In the event, the project came to a disastrous conclusion when William Gifford proceeded to edit Lamb's original review out of sight. Wordsworth's response on this occasion was to show a great concern for the effect this treatment had on Lamb. His letters are full of gratitude, of sympathy, and of understanding. In the following year, Lamb wrote at length to Wordsworth on the first collected edition of his poems. The long letters show how carefully and thoughtfully Lamb and Mary were reading them, and that the response reported is a shared one. Though expressing fulsome appreciation and gratitude for the gift, he continues to insist on his authority to criticize the collection in a way that will not have made easy reading for Wordsworth. So he writes, "I'm almost sorry that you printed extracts from those first poems. They have diminished the value of the original, which I possess only as a curiosity. I have hitherto kept them distinct in my mind as referring to a particular period of your life. All the rest of your poems are so much of a piece. They might have been written in the same week. These decidedly speak of an earlier period. They tell more of what you had been reading." Lamb describes a situation where he seems to be repeatedly diverted from an uninterrupted reading of Wordsworth's new volumes. Wordsworth himself has been the cause of his decision to return to a study of the original lyrical ballads. Then there is the fact that, as he never tired of reminding Wordsworth, he's a Londoner who, unlike his fortunate friend in Cumberland, is obliged to work for a living. "I should have written before, but am cruelly engaged and like to be. This is Sunday, and the headache I have is part late hours at work, the 2 preceding nights, and part late hours over a consoling pipe afterwards." Yeah, you can hear Wordsworth sighing deeply at this point. In a second letter, he confesses to having been distracted by reading the poems of Vincent Bourne, when he meant to be commenting on the beauties of Yarrow Visited. By the way, I must look out VB for you. Having praised the stanza from Yarrow Visited, however, he confesses himself not entirely satisfied with the poem on the whole. And of poor Susan, he advises the last verse was to be got rid of at all events. Now, Vincent Bourne, an early 18th century author of Latin poems, quoted enthusiastically by Elia in The Decay of Beggars, might well have been considered by the inhabitants of Rydal Mount a less than worthy distraction from Wordsworth's first collected edition, although the poem Elia uses in his essay is very much of a piece with Wordsworth's writing on the moral values of vagrancy and on the art of the epitaph. 1815 was the year of the publication of The White Doe of Ralston. We can only guess at Wordsworth's reaction when Lamb wrote to him describing the way in which he anticipated seeing The White Doe in print, given that he well knew how highly Wordsworth valued both The White Doe and Peter Bell, and this is the second extract before you now. "No alderman ever longed after a haunch of buck venison more than for a spiritual taste of that white doe you promised. I am sure it is superlative, or will be when dressed, i.e. printed. All things read raw to me in manuscript. The only one which I think would not very much win upon me in print is Peter Bell, but I'm not certain." 2 years later, on December 28th, 1817, we're given an intriguing insight into where the relationship between the two men stood when they both attended what became known as the Immortal Dinner, given by Benjamin Robert Haydon. The major participants were Lamb, Wordsworth, Keats, Monkhouse, Joseph Ritchie, and an unnamed civil servant who felt he had a claim on Wordsworth's attention as a fellow controller of stamps. Haydon's account was written up long after the event, of course, but it retains a ring of truth where Lamb and to some extent Wordsworth were concerned. "Now," said Lamb, "you old lake poet, you rascally poet, why do you call Voltaire dull?" In the anarchic exchanges that followed, Lamb, by now very drunk, pointed to the bemused civil servant and demanded of his host, "Do let me have another look at that gentleman's organs." Haydon assures us it was delightful to see the good humour of Wordsworth and giving in to all our frolics without affectation and laughing as heartily as the best of us. Maybe. 2 years after this, Lamb's copy of Wordsworth's Peter Bell was set down upon his desk. The next item, please. He had already read Reynolds' anticipatory parody. The moment Wordsworth opened Lamb's letter acknowledging the arrival of his copy, he will have known that he was to be greeted by a predictably eccentric response, if for no other reason than that it was penned in alternate lines of red and black ink. Glancing at the final paragraph, he will have seen that the colour changed with each word, and by the time he got to the end, what Wordsworth read would have most likely prompted a resigned shake of the head. How do you like my way of writing with 2 inks? Suppose Mrs. W. adopts it the next time she holds the pen for you. A remark that, as Richard Gravel has it, is without doubt susceptible of irony. Right, let's go to the beginning of the letter, which you have there, and we begin. Dear Wordsworth, I received a copy of Peter Bell a week ago, and I hope the author will not be offended if I say I do not much relish it. The humour, if it is meant for humour, is forced, and then the price. 6pence would have been dear for it. As Wordsworth read on, however, he will have discovered that Lamb was referring to Reynolds' parody and not his own poem, and that he had therefore already been well and truly wrong-footed. After inveighing against Wordsworth's detractors and those sycophants who try to hitch a lift on the great poet's coattails, Lamb states, Peter Bell, not the mock one, is excellent. We seem to be back on course. No. The next sentence reads, for its matter, I mean. Now, Lamb was having the same problems with Peter Bell that readers have had ever since. And he writes, I cannot say that the style of it quite satisfies me. It is too lyrical. The auditors to whom it is feigned to be told do not aride me. I had rather it had been told me, the reader, at once. Heartleap well is the tale for me, in matter as good as this, in manner infinitely before it, in my poor judgment. Why did you not add the Wagoner? Have I thanked you, though, yet for Peter Bell? I would not have it for a good deal of money. It becomes increasingly clear that Lamb genuinely dislikes the poem, and that in fact his opening gambit is applicable to Wordsworth's Peter Bell every bit as much as it is to the parody. By lyrical, I assume he means a dislike of the doggerel rhythms. His preference is for a simpler narrative style, manner, introducing listeners within the poem that stand between the poet and the reader, not to mention a narrator who, unlike the 2 narrators of Heartleap Well, confesses to his own ineptitude, leave the traditionalist Lamb dissatisfied. Nothing could be more revealing than the double negative with which he thanks Wordsworth for the gift. I would not have it. According to Crabbe Robinson, who'd shown Lamb a manuscript copy of Peter Bell in 1812, he disliked the poem from the outset, and in 1819 confided to Robinson that he still thought it one of the worst of Wordsworth's works. The strategy that Lamb used to deal with the problem of writing a thank you note to his friend for a poem he disliked so much is ingenious. There are 2 distinct voices simultaneously at work here. The seriousness of the criticism is interleaved with a theatrical buffoonery that purports to chastise the author of the parody. But when Lamb defiantly insists that the parodist has in fact encouraged him to read more, not less poetry by Wordsworth, he does so by way of parodying a key moment in Peter Bell. But why waste a wish on him? This is Reynolds, the parodist. Why waste a wish on him? I do not believe that paddling about with a stick in a pond and fishing up a dead author, whom his intolerable wrongs have driven to that deed of desperation, would turn the heart of one of these obtuse literary belles. I am glad this aspiration came upon the red ink line. It is more of a bloody curse. The latter part of the letter is taken up with a lengthy account of the delivery of two other copies of the poem to friends, one of whom is George Dyer. Dyer, he explains, has a habit of collecting books he has no intention of reading. Lamb then apologizes for this digression, seeming to dismiss it as a laborious curiosity. Reading between the lines, however, it is clear that the phrase more properly belongs via the unread copy of Peter Bell now sitting on Dyer's shelves to the poem itself. He then concludes with the apparently encouraging observation that Wordsworth ought not to be disheartened by the inadequate critical judgments of poetasters, implying not only Reynolds, but, given his mention of inks in the plural, also his own credentials as a critic. The scantily camouflaged purpose of what he writes here, however, is to dismiss Peter Bell as an unreadable, laborious curiosity, which has no more poetic merit than the productions of miserable poetasters like Reynolds and himself. This is surely the conclusion that must be drawn from Lamb's use of the patronizingly arch phrase, "whatsoever you write," in his final sentence, right at the bottom there. Pushing his copy of Peter Bell to one side, along with his letter, he explains, "My dinner waits. I have no time to indulge any longer in these laborious curiosities. God bless you, and cause to thrive and to burgeon whatsoever you write. And fear no inks of miserable poetasters. Mary's love, yours truly, Charles Lamb." Wordsworth's response? Wordsworth's response was to dedicate the Wagoner to his friend and send him a copy of it when it was published in the month following his gift of Peter Bell. And so to our last brief section. Slide for this one, please. I've headed this "A Spirit of Beautiful Tolerance," and it comes from a letter from Lamb to Wordsworth on the receipt of the Wagoner. Having done all that stuff around Peter Bell, Wordsworth then sent him the Wagoner, and Lamb probably thinks, oh gosh, maybe I was a bit mean. The relationship between Lamb and Wordsworth is indicative of the volatile post-Enlightenment culture we've come to think of as Romanticism. In 1923, Arthur Lovejoy insisted that what he termed diversitarianism constituted the most significant and distinctive feature of the Romantic Revolution. And M.H. Abrahams subsequently described the period in which Wordsworth and Lamb were writing as grounded in a preference for maximum diversity, for the fullness of individuality, and for particularity. It should come as no surprise, therefore, that Lamb and Wordsworth were contradictory individuals representing in themselves or through the voices of their fictional narrators fundamentally different ways of seeing, indicative of a tension which became a commonplace point of reference in subsequent attempts to define Romanticism. For Nietzsche, writing in The Birth of Tragedy, the key to this discussion lay in what he called an Apollinian and Dionysian duality, which had originated in the evolution of Hellenic art and remained fundamental to an understanding of 19th century culture. So here we go. These two different tendencies, Apollinian and Dionysian, run parallel to each other, for the most part openly at variance, and they continually incite each other to new and more powerful births, which perpetuate an antagonism only superficially reconciled by the common term art. Wordsworth was understating the case, I suggest, when in the prelude he wrote that, in the course of reflecting on his past, I see two consciousnesses, conscious of myself and of some other being. This is the poet who, having invoked the single authoritarian presence of John Milton for his muse in The Excursion, proceeded to distribute the narrative voice for that poem between 4 contending protagonists. After 9 books and 9,068 lines of poetry, the great moral questions that have been posed remain unsolved or unresolved. In this, he was being no more than consistent with a recurring feature of his earlier writing. And in Peter Bell, when the squire complains of the narrator's inability to begin his epic story in the correct place, the long shadow of Paradise Lost is once more in evidence. The squire cried, "Sure as paradise was lost to us by Adam's sinning, we are all wandering in a wood, and therefore, sir, I wish you would begin at the beginning." Beneath the seemingly offhand doggerel of Peter Bell lurks the high seriousness and sobriety of Wordsworth's Apollinian tendency, to use Nietzsche's term. And intriguingly, Keats chose to refer to Wordsworth's remote and sublime muse as derived from Apollo when he was comparing Peter Bell to J.H.A. Reynolds' parodic version of the poem in 1819. Over against this, we should set Lamb's Dionysian description of the figure of the drunken dog he cut at Nether Stowey in 1797. The Wagoner, which Wordsworth dedicated to Dionysian Lamb, is among other things a treatise on the evils of the demon drink, in which its Apollinian author portrays himself as a simple water-drinking bard, and tells the sorry tale of a would-be reformed drunkard. In 1886, Nietzsche's critique of contemporary culture suggests in its turn an intriguing critique of Wordsworth's water-drinking bard. The satire, like the idyllic shepherd of more recent times, is the offspring of a longing for the primitive and the natural, but how timorously and mawkishly modern man dallied with the flattering image of a sentimental flute-playing tender shepherd. The idyllic shepherd of modern man is merely a counterfeit of the sum of cultural illusions that are allegedly nature. The Dionysian Greek wants truth and nature in their most forceful form, and sees himself changed, as if by magic, into a satyr. On the evidence of what Lamb wrote on the subject of Wordsworth's poetry in his letters, those flute-playing tender shepherds were never going to make a particularly profound impression on him, any more than were the mountains amongst which he lived. Now, in her recent book, Modernity's Mist, British Romanticism and the Poetics of Anticipation, Emily Rohrbach explores the way in which Romanticism may be understood as ushering in a wholly new era of fragmentation and uncertainty that persists through to the present day. When she argues that the fault line may be broadly identified as one where poetic experience comes into tension with or even exceeds referential meaning, the tensions that emerge repeatedly in Wordsworth's poetry come to mind, along with the struggles which many writers at this time were having to understand their world through an appeal to historical precedents that proved increasingly inadequate to explain an alarmingly unpredictable present. A multitude of causes unknown to former times are now acting with a combined force to blunt the discriminating powers of the mind, was how Wordsworth put it, obviously in Preface to Lyrical Ballads, 1800. And Rohrbach's commentary points up the way in which the political and cultural upheavals that lie at the heart of Romanticism offer us a window that opens onto our own contemporary condition. She writes, "These literary works offer access to peculiarly modern temporalities, to an experience of shifting grounds of knowing, a paradoxical anticipation of the unpredictable, and an encounter with the not fully knowable present. Time is fluid. The self can never be fixed. This is about life experienced through Elian eyes as theatre, as dream, as make-believe, inducing an interplay of dream and reality through time. In Paul Ricoeur's words, the contemporaneity of Romanticism establishes for us a world where there is inexorable plurality on the one side, impenetrable solitude on the other. And it is to Ricoeur's inexorable plurality and Rohrbacher's not fully knowable present that Charles Lamb Elia appeals when contemplating the poetic talent in his essay, Sanity of True Genius. If you can have the final slide, please. In the final paragraph, Lamb writes, "Let the most romantic of us, that has been entertained all night with the spectacle of some wild and magnificent vision, recombine it in the morning and try it by his waking judgment. That which appeared so shifting and yet so coherent, while that faculty was passive, when it comes under cool examination, shall appear so reasonless and so unlinked that we are ashamed to have been so deluded, and to have taken, though but in sleep, a monster for a god. But the transitions in this episode are every whit as violent as in the most extravagant dream, and yet the waking judgment ratifies them. So that is a huge but. Nietzsche's duality of Apollo and Dionysius is woven into the fabric of this remarkable passage in Everything But Name. The Dionysian wild and magnificent vision of the night is subjected to an Apollonian cool examination in the morning light, leaving us to reflect on how successful Lamb has been in reconciling the Dionysian monster with the Apollonian god. For surely this is what he intends. When we consider that two men as different as Charles Lamb and William Wordsworth were capable of sustaining a genuinely caring friendship throughout their lives, the conclusion must be that such a reconciliation is indeed possible. Thank you for listening.